Today is Saturday, 12th October, and for the Jewish people, the period from the evening of Friday, 11th October, in other words, yesterday, through to today, is Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, the single most important day in the Jewish calendar, an absolutely important day for all of the Jewish people. And of course, this particular day of atonement, is celebrated by the Jewish people at a particularly fraught time, something of which I, for one, am very, very much aware of. Anyway, on a geopolitical or strategic level, which is the topic of these programs, the fact that we are now in the midst of the period of Yom Kippur, that probably is sufficient in itself to explain why no more military action is being taken by Israel at this particular point in time, over and above that military action which is already underway in South Lebanon and Gaza and in other places. Some days ago, a member, somebody who corresponds with me regularly, one of the most insightful people I know, pointed out to me that, in her opinion, it was extremely unlikely, all but inconceivable, that Israel would conduct a strike, an attack on Iran immediately prior to or during Yom Kippur. Well, that analysis may have been right. It is a factor which, as I said, should not be disregarded. And at the moment, as I said, on this day of all days, I personally do not believe that an attack of that nature will take place. But Yom Kippur ends today. Tomorrow is another day. And maybe on that day or soon after, we will see the Israeli strike on Iran take place. Well, anyway, let's wait and see what the Israelis do. As I said, we've been promised by Yoav Gallant, the Israeli defense minister, that the attack will be precise, powerful, and surprising in a way that the Iranians do not anticipate. So we will see what exactly it is that the Israelis do, and we will see when exactly they do it. It may be as soon as tomorrow, it may be over the next couple of days or weeks, or the fact that the Israelis are talking about a surprising attack may mean that the attack will happen at a time when no one expects, which could be sometime when it appears that the present atmosphere of crisis, the tense atmosphere that we're seeing at the moment, has abated. Anyway, even as we await the Israeli strike, the Iranians, for their part, have been active. There is an article in the Financial Times which discusses how Iran has been in contact with all of the Gulf Arab states, urging them to remain neutral in this conflict between Iran and Israel. It seems from the Financial Times article that the Gulf states are being receptive to these Israeli requests and that they are themselves busy contacting the US, urging the US to persuade the Israelis to exercise restraint. The Gulf states, the Gulf monarchies, the Arab states on the Gulf, the Arab oil producers, do not want a wider war, a war in which they themselves might find themselves sucked in with potential Iranian attacks against their oil installations, which would for them be a very, very alarming and dangerous and indeed existential development. And following on from the fact that the Iranians are making moves in the Middle East, in the Gulf, uh, reaching out to the Arab Gulf states. We learn from the Financial Times that the Iranian Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi has recently visited Riyadh in Saudi Arabia, where he has had a meeting with the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, who is also the Prime Minister of Saudi Arabia, and as many believe, the de facto ruler of Saudi Arabia, or at least the person who exercises day-to-day control of policy on behalf of the king. Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, the man who most people refer to as MBS. And we're told by the Saudi news agency, state news agency, that the two discussed the latest regional developments, Araghchi and MBS did, and the impression one gets is that this was a cordial meeting. Though with the Saudis, they are always very careful, I've noticed, as many people have pointed out also, to choose their words very, very carefully. Statements by the Saudi authorities are always very measured and use very moderately chosen language. But anyway, the point is MBS did meet with Araghchi, and all the indications are, from all that we know, the meeting went well. And of course, some days ago, Pezeshkian also had meetings with important officials from the Gulf states, and there was a meeting, I think it was between Pezeshkian and the foreign minister of Saudi Arabia, and that meeting apparently went well also. So, for the moment at least, the Gulf states have made a decision that they're going to remain neutral in this crisis. As the Financial Times article goes out of its way to remind us, relations between the Gulf states and Iran have not always been especially friendly. In fact, in the case of Saudi Arabia and Iran, they have been straightforwardly hostile. This isn't true of all the Gulf states. Qatar, despite hosting a major American base, has historically had reasonably good relations with Iran. But some of the other Gulf states have not. But for the moment, at least, they've decided that their best interests are in heeding this Iranian call and remaining neutral. Of course, if war comes, if it escalates out of control, then the Gulf states, the Saudis as well, may have to reconsider their stance, and that is something that will concern in different ways both Jerusalem and Tehran, and perhaps Washington as well. But anyway, that is the position at the moment. Now, the Financial Times has also provided a lengthy, though frankly not very revealing, discussion about the meeting between Pezeshkian and Putin in Ashgabat. And in fact, this meeting has been covered in several places in the British media as well. The Daily Telegraph, which takes a very strong interest in both Russian and Iranian matters, has also covered this meeting. And again, both of these newspapers, the Financial Times and the Daily Telegraph, have attempted to play down its significance, even as and at the same time as, in the case of the Daily Telegraph, they claim or pretend that this meeting was arranged at very, very short notice, that Putin had no plans at this particular time to visit Ashgabat, to visit Turkmenistan, and that the meeting of Central Asian states that took place in Ashgabat was arranged purely in order to provide cover for Putin's visit and his meeting with Pezeshkian. I have to say straight away that I think that is complete nonsense. Putin regularly visits Central Asian states. It was time for him to visit Turkmenistan, with which Russia has a strategic partnership and which is a major ally in terms of gas production and export and that sort of thing. So it was high time for Putin to visit Turkmenistan. The relations between Turkmenistan and Russia are friendly and close, though Turkmenistan has been careful to safeguard its independence, and it has not become a member either of the Eurasian Economic Union or of the Collective Security Treaty Organization, Russia's two major institutional Eurasian bodies. But nonetheless, as I said, the two countries are friends. A visit to Turkmenistan undoubtedly was prepared sometime in advance, and there's every reason to think that with Putin coming to the region, the Central Asian leaders would want to meet with him anyway, given how vitally important Russia continues to be in Central Asian affairs. That is not to say that the meeting between Pezeshkian and Putin was not arranged at relatively short notice, but it's not something that has been done in quite the way that the Daily Telegraph, for one, is pretending. Anyway, we're told that this is in the Financial Times, that the meeting touched to a certain extent on economic matters. Both the Financial Times and the Daily Telegraph say that there's going to be a further summit meeting in Kazan later this month, which may touch on defense cooperation. That's the Financial Times. The Daily Telegraph says that there's going to be another meeting in Kazan in a few weeks' time, which is going to be an economic summit. Note that neither the Daily Telegraph nor the Financial Times can bring themselves to admit that what is actually coming in a few weeks in Kazan is a summit meeting of the BRICS states. Neither the Daily Telegraph nor the Financial Times even mention BRICS. There's going to be this meeting in Kazan, but it's apparently going to just be a meeting. As I said, we're not told that it's actually going to be the big BRICS summit meeting of the year, which is really quite extraordinary and tells us more, I think, than anything else about how nervous the Western powers are about the development of the BRICS, the single biggest development in some respects in international affairs over the last, couple of years. But anyway, moving on. We're told that Pezeshkian and Putin are going to be meeting again in Kazan. As I said, we're not told the context. It is going to happen in the context of a BRICS summit meeting. We're also told by the Daily Telegraph that there had been discussion in Russia of a strategic partnership agreement being signed between Pezeshkian and Putin, but that this didn't happen in this meeting in Ashgabat, which is again ridiculous. If the Russian and Iranian presidents were going to sign a strategic partnership agreement, they would certainly not have done so at the back end of a meeting like this in Ashgabat. It would certainly have happened in one of the two capitals, either Tehran or Moscow. Just saying. Probably it will happen, or it could happen in Kazan. It will certainly not happen in a small out-of-the-way place relatively out of the way place like Ashgabat. But anyway, but perhaps more interestingly, the Financial Times does talk about the question of military deliveries, especially of air defense missiles by Russia to Iran. And we are told that some media in Iran have been critical of Russia. At least that was what I think an earlier version of the Financial Times article was saying, but I read this elsewhere, that some media in Iran have been critical of Russia for not so far supplying S-400 missiles and their associated technology. And that, if true, by the way, argues against the truth of those reports, which appeared in the American media, the US media, about 6 weeks ago, that the Russians had started to supply S-400 missile systems to Iran. So maybe those deliveries are still under discussion and have not yet begun, though I am fairly sure that they will come and that they will come fairly soon. And there is also obviously discussion of delivery of Russian fighter jets, and there is speculation about whether or not those deliveries will come, though the Financial Times makes the not unreasonable point that the Russians themselves, obviously being involved as they are in a major conflict in Ukraine, will want to husband their forces, their weapon systems, to the extent that they can, because they need them in Ukraine and might not have that much to give to Iran at this particular time. For the record, I think Russian production of all of these systems, Sukhoi 35 jets and S-400 missile systems, is now sufficiently great to be able to provide at least some deliveries of some systems to Iran. And if a decision is made to do that, that would be probably a priority. I don't know this for a fact, but I think it's a reasonable guess that a decision to supply Iran with S-400 missiles has indeed been made. And I'm going to make a further guess that what's actually happening and what perhaps lies behind some of those reports from the United States a couple of weeks ago about S-400 deliveries being already underway is that, in fact, Iranian technicians and operators are currently in Russia training to use these systems, which could therefore be some months away from delivery. Anyway, that's my guess. Of course, we've heard other reports that the Russians have also provided the Iranians with electronic warfare systems. That also may be true. There's huge amounts of uncertainty about all of this. But anyway, the media in the West has noticed this meeting between Pezeshkian and Putin, even though they are having difficulty assessing its significance. And as I said, I find it fascinating how they go out of their way to avoid discussing the fact that when these two leaders meet again in 2 weeks' time, it will be in a BRICS summit meeting held in Russia, in Kazan. Anyway, let's move on. As I said, we await to see what's going to happen in the Middle East. It is essential to remember that fighting in southern Lebanon continues maybe Yom Kippur, but that's not preventing the fighting taking place. I've seen a commentary by a expert, Western expert. I seem to recall that he's based at a British university. He said that so far, despite intense fighting and despite Israel taking some losses, they have not succeeded in breaking through and denting Hezbollah's fortifications, its fortifications and tunnel network in southern Lebanon. So, according to this expert, the fighting is still ongoing and it is attritional, and it has not so far, from an Israeli point of view, been successful. In the meantime, however, large numbers of people are being killed, and I read a report that a report in the Israeli and Lebanese media that apparently the Lebanese government is saying that yesterday 22 Lebanese civilians were killed. Apparently the heaviest number of civilians killed in a single strike over the course of the fighting in Lebanon so far, the fighting that has taken place in Lebanon over the last couple of weeks. Anyway, that's one report. Second point I wanted to quickly make is that I discussed a couple of programs ago a lengthy article in the Daily Telegraph which looked at the effectiveness of Iran's missile strike on Israel and concluded that it had been extremely effective and maybe not extremely effective, but that it had been effective, that a significant amount of missiles did in fact get through and hit their targets, even though Iran appeared to be still pulling its punches. Now, I've recently learned that Theodore Postol, a renowned rocket scientist and somebody who is an absolutely definitive authority on this sort of issue. Anyway, he's done a program on Daniel Davis' Deep Dive in which he's looked at the effect of the Iranian missile strike on Israel, and he's come to the identical conclusions that have appeared in the Daily Telegraph article. Now, I ought to say I understand that Professor Postol gave these opinions before, not after, that Daily Telegraph article appeared. But anyway, the accumulation of evidence that we have now does, it seems to me, confirm that this was, from an Iranian point of view, a successful strike. They demonstrated that they have missiles with advanced hypersonic capabilities, that the Israeli air defense system cannot successfully intercept all of them and risks becoming overwhelmed by missile barrages, and that some of these missiles, at least a significant proportion of them, managed to penetrate Israeli defenses and to hit the targets. I think now we can say that this is correct. I think that we can't continue and pretend that this missile strike was ineffective, as the American and Israeli governments keep telling us. Anyway, there we are. Let's move on and let's return to the perennial topic of the current time, which is the conflict in Ukraine. Well, we're getting, as always, contradictory information. One piece of information, in fact, in some ways, the most interesting piece of information in terms of the diplomacy, is that President Zelensky of Ukraine has arrived in London. He's had a meeting with Prime Minister Starmer, And from what I can tell, this time the meeting did not go especially well, because it looks as if, from the reports that are appearing in the British media, Prime Minister Starmer has rowed back on earlier commitments that were being made to Ukraine to greenlight the use of Storm Shadow missiles for deep strikes on Russian territory. And apparently, Prime Minister Starmer told Zelensky that he could not think of a single war that had been won by a single weapon, and that the Ukrainians should not overestimate the effectiveness of the Storm Shadow system. Well, by the way, that last point provoked predictable anger from some commentators on threads in articles that have appeared discussing those words in the British media. And I noticed that all sorts of people trotted out the claim that, in fact, it was the nuclear weapons that were used in 1945 that ended the war with Japan and all of that, and that Prime Minister Starmer clearly doesn't know what he's talking about when he says that a single weapon can't win a war by itself. But of course, this is an absurd analogy. First of all, historically, it isn't true. By the time the nuclear weapons were used, Japan's position had already become critical, and no one doubted that Japan would be defeated fairly soon, assuming that, the previous 4 years of war were somehow unconnected to the collapse of Japan in August 1945. Seems far-fetched, to say the least. But anyway, putting that aside. But anyway, I mean, making any kind of comparisons between the Storm Shadow system and the nuclear weapons that were used against Japan in 1945 is absurd, and people should resist, should stop making those kind of parallels, even if they're only doing so in order to try to ridicule Prime Minister Starmer. Just saying. So it's bad history and it's bad commentary. But anyway, put all that aside, I can't imagine that Zelensky was pleased to hear all of that. And my own impression is that over the course of this European tour that he's been conducting, what he's finding is that certainly on the part of the major powers, Britain, France, Germany, Italy, Spain, the doors are starting to close on him. With the Americans looking like they're edging away, the other European allies, the other big NATO states, are saying to themselves that the point has come, if the Americans are edging away, when, regardless of our own feelings, we have no choice but to do so also. That's my view. Having said that, there are also contradictory signals. There are reports that the United States is now thinking of supplying Ukraine with the long-range 900-kilometer JASSMs air-launched cruise missile. I don't know whether this is true. This is so contrary to what we're hearing coming from the United States at the moment that I would personally be skeptical. But then it's not inconceivable that someone in Washington, sensing that everything in Ukraine is falling apart fast, worried about the possible outcomes of the coming presidential election and the policies that might be followed by the incoming administration, whoever leads it, that they may have decided that They've got to try and change the situation as quickly as they can and somehow lock the US into indefinite support for Ukraine, and that as a result of that person's decision, a decision to supply these long-range JASSMs systems has been made. It would be a very serious escalation indeed if something like that has indeed happened. But as I said, I would wait to see more definite confirmation of this before I leapt to that before I accepted that conclusion. Certainly, I have seen nothing about this in the British media or the American media, and had a decision of that kind been made, I would have expected that there would be more reporting of it. So that's the first thing to say. The other is, and this is indisputable, that apparently the NATO states are presumably also in advance, not so much of the forthcoming election, but perhaps in advance of the inauguration of the new president in January. Anyway, it seems that the NATO states are undertaking a major review of NATO's long-term relationship with Russia. And here I think it is indisputable. The objective, which is being advanced by the NATO bureaucracy, is to move away from some of the agreements that were reached between Russia and NATO in the mid-1990s, the Russia-NATO Founding Act, the setting up of the Russia-NATO Council, things like that, agreements and institutions which were supposed to provide some kind of bridge between NATO and Russia. These all date from the 1990s when Yeltsin was president of Russia, and the Russian government at that time was pursuing a deeply unpopular policy, both domestically and in foreign policy, which many Russians felt was sacrificing Russian interests and leading to economic collapse and chaos within Russia itself, but which, of course, Westerners, on the contrary, saw as promising a great new dawn in which Russia would attach itself indefinitely in some form to the West. Anyway, apparently NATO now wants to do away with all of those agreements and reclassify Russia as an enemy. And I suspect that even though we're told that no general clear-cut decision about this has been reached so far, I suspect that there will be intense meetings going on between now and January. And of course, if the wrong person, if Donald Trump wins in November, even more intense meetings between now and January in order to codify and lock in a new policy which treats Russia as an enemy, not just as an adversary, but as an outright enemy and as a threat, and which tries to convert NATO, or not convert NATO, but at least lock in NATO into that stance, and by extension, lock in the United States as well. So of that, I have no doubt, I'm sure that is already underway, and all the usual people, Mark Rutte, the British, some people in Germany, the Scandinavians, the Baltic states, they will be busy pushing this agenda for all it's worth. And some of the countries in NATO might try to push back. But in these kind of arguments, the hardliners always seem to win. And I'm fairly confident that on this, they will, of course, get their way. Whether any of this really will lock in the United States, whether it really will restrict the decisions the next president makes, is another matter. It depends both on the will of the president, the unity and strength of his team or her team, and the extent to which the president has wide support amongst the people and to some extent the political movers and shakers in the United States. If the president is strong, determined, and has a sufficient degree of backing, then any attempt to tie him down or to tie her down in this kind of way is a little bit like the European Lilliputians trying to tie Gulliver down. It won't succeed. Anyway, let's move on and look at other things that are going on the battlefronts. Now, Alexei Arestovitch, who was Zelensky's previous spokesman, his spin doctor, if you will. Anyway, Arestovitch has now said that he expects that over the next couple of days or weeks, the Russians will begin a general offensive right across the entire line of contact. And he speaks about an offensive from the Russians on a scale that we have not seen at any point before during the entire conflict. I don't know where Arestovitch gets his information from, but he may be right, and it could be that the Russians are now assessing that the Ukrainians are so weak at the moment that the moment for such an offensive, such a great offensive, has come. My own view is that we are still some months away from any step like that. I would have thought that the Russians would want to clear up the various places where they're fighting at the moment, that they'd want to capture Kurakovo, Selidovo, and of course Pokrovsk. We'll come to all that soon. That they'd want to finish the battle for Toretsk, that they'd want to finish the battle for Chasiv Yar, and that they'd want to drive the Ukrainians fully out of Kursk region before they conducted an offensive of that kind. I think they're probably also calculating that aggressive attrition still has some way to go, and that these battles, these attritional battles that they're fighting in all of these places that I've just mentioned, continue to play to Russia's advantage, and that the time for the offensive, if it is launched in that kind of way, will come when not just when all of these places fall, but when the Ukrainians are further massively weakened through their attempts to defend themselves to defend their positions in all of these places. But in the meantime, it's perhaps worth saying that the situation for the Ukrainians, in pure attritional terms, is becoming extremely bad. Now, there was an article in the London Times which talked about mass desertions by Ukrainian soldiers, more and more Ukrainian soldiers simply refusing to fight. There was a report in Forbes about how a Ukrainian armored force was ambushed by the Russians in Kursk region, inside Russia, in other words. And, well, anyone who follows the course of the fighting closely now can see that over most of the battlefields, the Ukrainians are now being are now moving around increasingly in trucks or even commercial cars, ordinary passenger cars, rather than in armoured vehicles any longer. They do, of course, still have some armoured vehicles, they still have some tanks, but one senses that the quantities of these are falling and falling rapidly. Now, it could be that the Ukrainians are husbanding such armour as they have left and that they're using it to build up brigades in the rear. But I'm going to say straight away, I don't think so. I think that my impression is that there have not been big deliveries of Western weapons anymore. And I get the sense that those deliveries of Western weapons, the big deliveries, have ended. Speaker Johnson in the United States has now all come out and he's made further comments about the situation in terms of funding for Ukraine. He said in a tweet, I believe, that he's tired of further funding requests from Ukraine. He's anxious to see this whole thing end, and he's hoping that when President Trump is re-elected President of the United States, which of course, as a Republican, Speaker Johnson wants to happen, that Trump will find some way of bringing the whole conflict to an end very fast. By the way, the former Russian president, Dmitry Medvedev, who is now the deputy chair of Russia's Security Council, immediately responded to Speaker Johnson's comments by making it clear again that the only acceptable outcome of the war from a Russian point of view is one which makes it clear that Ukraine, whatever's left of Ukraine, will be neutral and outside NATO. So anyway, these signals backwards and forwards between the Americans and the Russians are taking place. Anyway, I understand that there's relatively little funding now available in the United States, that large numbers of armoured vehicles and other advanced systems are no longer being supplied in the same quantities to Ukraine any longer, that the package that was authorized by Congress has effectively run its course. There's still some money left, but the United States is struggling to find equipment that it can spend that money on, even though President Biden wants to front load all that money, send that money, or use that money as quickly as possible. The Europeans are cutting back. The British are saying they have no more to give. The French apparently are saying the same. So I don't think that there is a big pool of armoured vehicles in Ukraine able to be used to build up new brigades, to mechanise those brigades, and to launch them into battle. So Ukraine is short of men, short of trained men. Recently mobilised soldiers are unhappy and unwilling to fight. Mobilisation in Ukraine is becoming increasingly coercive and brutal, and in ways that look to me as if they can only be counterproductive in political terms. There was some extraordinary pictures of a crowd of people leaving a rock concert, I believe in Kiev, only to find that the recruiters from the Ukrainian military were there, and that men were being seized and hauled off into the army, even as they were leaving the rock concert, with some members of the crowd reacting angrily and altercations and, well, all the usual things that one would expect taking place. So it's clear to me that Ukraine is weakening, it's ebbing, But I suspect that the Russians feel that they have some more work to do before they start thinking about general offensives and that sort of thing. Now, before I proceed to discuss what's actually going on the battlefields in Ukraine, I just wanted to say quickly a number of things. Firstly, there is a report floating around that North Korean soldiers have been seen fighting alongside the Russians in Ukraine. North Korea and Russia have both categorically denied that, and so far I have seen no definite proof of this. I think it is extremely unlikely to be the case. This is my own view. It could be that what has happened is that some East Asian soldiers from Russia's own East Asian nationalities, people like the Buryats, these are Siberian people, who are obviously, have East Asian, Mongolian appearance, that they've been mistaken for North Koreans. I say that because there's apparently been some volunteer formations which have come together, bringing together people of these nationalities. One of these formations, I believe they were Buryats, took part in the fighting in Ugledar, and it could be that, as I said, they were seen there and that they were mistaken for North Koreans. Anyway, that's my own guess. I see no evidence that, as I said, North Korean troops are fighting alongside the Russians in Ukraine. And it could be that another explanation for this report is a separate report, which I believe is circulating within the Russian media, that the Russians have resumed officer training programs. These will be senior officers, officer training programs for North Korean officers. As I said, these will not be people who train to become lieutenants and that sort of thing. It's probably the higher command colleges in Russia, the ones that train brigade and divisional commanders, and the General Staff Academy in Moscow that is now taking North Korean officers for training. This, of course, used to happen during the Cold War with a rapprochement between North Korea and Russia. It's likely that this has resumed, but it doesn't mean that these people are actually fighting for the Russians on the actual battle lines. Anyway, with all of that, let's turn to what's actually taking place on the battlefronts. Now, yesterday, I spoke at some length about Russian missile strikes on commercial shipping, going to the port of Odessa. Today, we've had reports of further Russian missile strikes against Ukraine's energy system. I have not yet had details of this. I'm going to defer the discussion of that until my program tomorrow, when we have more information about this. But what we do have is further information pointing to a critical situation for the Ukrainians, the Ukrainian army in Kursk region. In fact, the situation there, which DS, the Ukrainian mapping project, yesterday said was horrible, the situation is so bad that it has provoked comments from the military commander of the Ukrainian armed forces, General Syrsky himself. He has admitted that the situation in Kursk region is extremely difficult. He says that the Russians have concentrated 50,000 troops in Kursk region. that may be true. He says that they've been reassigned to Kursk region from Kherson region and Zaporozhye region and Kramatorsk direction, which presumably means Chasiv Yar, and Siversk. There is some truth to this. As I've said, the 106th Airborne Guards Division, which is a paratroop division of the Russian army, does appear to have been reassigned to Kursk region from the Siversk area. I haven't seen any evidence that any troops from Chasiv Yar have been reassigned to Kursk region, but two Marine brigades, two naval infantry brigades of the Russian armed forces, which were previously in Kherson region and Zaporozhye region, do seem indeed to have been reassigned to Kursk region. But I doubt that all of these troops taken together come to 50,000 men. And if there are indeed 50,000 troops fighting with the Russian army in Kursk region, I'm going to suggest that they've mostly been reassigned there by a group of forces north, from places like Volchansk, where the Russians, however, according to the group of forces north, continue to advance in the high-rise building area, though only very slowly. Of course, a couple of days ago, group of forces north asserted that they have now taken complete control of the territory of the aggregate plant in Volchansk. Just saying. But anyway, I think that this is where the bulk of the Russian forces have come from. And if it's true that 50,000 troops are located in Kursk region, then that explains why the advance in Volchansk has slowed. Though, as I've said in previous programs, I get the sense that the Russians have also sent some troops to Kursk region from Kaliningrad, from the Kaliningrad area as well. Anyway, putting all that aside, the Russian advance continues. General Syrsky says that the Ukrainians haven't yet managed to stabilize the situation, but that he expects that they will soon successfully do so. But he does say that at the moment the situation is grave. Well, I think all of this is an understatement. I think the situation is much worse for the Ukrainians than Syrsky is saying. When Syrsky talks in this fashion, you can usually tell that the situation is indeed very bad for the Ukrainians. Indeed. Now, the first thing to say is that over the last 2 or 3 days, we're getting a lot of reports that the Ukrainian offensive, somewhat to the west of Sudzha, in the Glushkovo area, the area of the where the Ukrainians were trying to advance south up to the Sime River, that offensive has been a complete failure. That the Ukrainians not only were not able to reach the Sime River, but on the contrary, that the Russians have pushed them back completely, and that they've been pushed back completely, pretty much back to the Ukrainian border. So it looks as if that offensive, the offensive towards the Sime River, the attempt to capture Glushkovo, all of that has been a complete failure. Julian Repke, the German journalist from Bild Zeitung, has published a rather bitter tweet on this particular point. He's saying that, as I said, the offensive was a complete failure. The Glushkovo offensive was a complete failure. Now, this is a secondary theatre to the more important theatre, which is the battle around Suja. Now, group of forces north are now saying that they've advanced over the last 24 hours by a further 8 kilometers, but of course they're not telling us exactly where. In fact, they're not providing much information at all. There are reports that the Russians have completely encircled the village of Plechovo, which is located directly south of Suja, quite close to the Russian border. And I've said that if the Russians capture Plechovo, no, it's not just me, lots of commentators saying if the Russians capture Plechovo, then the way is open for the Russians to advance towards the R200 road, the road from Sumy to Suja, and that they will soon be in a position to interrupt Ukrainian supplies. But anyway, there are also reports that the Russians have now captured the village of Lyubimovka. This is a village which the Russians reached in their first counteroffensive on the west side of the pocket from Korenovo some weeks ago, when they also captured places like Snavgusk, Apanasovka, and Obukhivka. Supposedly, the Russians are also close, or perhaps have even reached, another village called Novo-Ivanovka, which is located immediately to the west of Lyubimovka. And there are lots of reports that the Ukrainians, that 2 Ukrainian battalions, well, group of forces north yesterday, so 2 Ukrainian battalions are cut off and effectively surrounded, one in the area of Olgovka, north of Lyubimovka, and the other apparently in the general area of Lyubimovka itself. By the way, if the Russians capture Novo-Ivanovka, that will bring them very close to the village of Malaya Loknia. Now, Malaya Loknia is a curious place because the Ukrainians were supposed to have captured it early on in the Kursk offensive. Then, about 6 weeks ago, Radovka claimed that Malaya Loknia had been captured by the Russians. This, for a very, very long time, went unacknowledged by the various mapping projects. Then a major battle was supposed to, then eventually they accepted that the Russians were indeed in occupation of Malaya Loknia, and a Russian officer who was involved in the fighting there actually went to Moscow, where he was presented to none other than Putin himself and was decorated for his successful defense of Malaya Loknia. Then about 10 days ago, or 2 weeks ago, the reports again began to appear that the Ukrainians had captured or recaptured Malaya Loknia, which might be true. I've noticed that Group of Forces North and the Russian Defense Ministry hasn't been talking much about Malaya Loknia recently, but it looks as if the Russians capture Novo-Ivanovka, that any Ukrainian recapture of Malaya Loknia will have been a short-term affair. If the Russians capture Novo-Ivanovka, if they recapture Malaya Loknia, or if indeed they still control Malaya Loknia, which probably they don't, and if they also either regain control or still have control of Cherkasskoye, Porechnoye, and Ruskaya Porechnoye, these places that I talked about, the places that Alaudinov, the Chechen officer, said were a kind of Bermuda Triangle, which the Ukrainians tried to capture, but where their forces disappear. Anyway, if the Russians still control these places, which I think probably they're being fought over and that they're in the grey zone, but probably the Russians will capture fairly soon. The Russians capture Martinovka as well. Well, then the entire pocket, the entire Kursk pocket will be reduced to one place, which is Suja itself. And there are reports circulating that the Ukrainians are aware of this and that they are busy establishing fortifications in Suja and in the areas around Suja, trying to secure the R200 road, anticipating that all of these places, Lyubiv, Novoivanovka, Malaya Loknia, Cherkasskoye Porechnoye, Ruskaya Porechnoye, Martinovka, the Russians further south control Ruskaya, Konopyelka, I don't think anybody disputes that, Ulyanovsk, Borki, before long they will control Plekhovo as well. That Suja in effect will be all but surrounded. But they can't retreat. Syrsky is talking about counterattacks, which might gain occasional ground. The Ukrainians may be trying to extricate those two battalions that have been surrounded. They might be successful in that. But as I said, if all of these places, as I said, are captured, all of these villages around Suja are captured, the Ukrainians, having in effect committed themselves to holding out indefinitely in Kursk region, it seems to me that they're not going to be able to pull out of Suja. And a siege of Suja, perhaps now, is starting to float on the horizon. Anyway, just saying. This Kursk operation has been a debacle. It's the only place where the Ukrainians have been able to operate with large numbers of armored vehicles. One senses that the Ukrainian reserve of armored vehicles was largely committed to the Kursk offensive. That has been largely spent. Thousands of men have been lost fighting in Kursk, either killed or wounded. And as we see, a debacle is shaping up. And I don't think the Ukrainians will be able to hold on to Suja if it is isolated in the way that it now appears it will be. And I think that probably in the autumn, the late autumn, after the rains, the Russians will indeed start an offensive and will drive into Sumy region. And, well, that will be another major crisis for Ukraine as well. Just saying. So that, I think, is where all this is going. And by the way, I think that the events that have played out in Kursk region not only vindicate the reporting of this battle by people like myself and Daniel Davis and others right from the start of this offensive back in August. We all expressed deep skepticism about where it was going and felt that it was a mistake. But to my mind, they may not exactly prove, but they lend even further credence to that claim provided to me by my source and accepted by American officers, people like Jim Webb and indeed Daniel Davis, or at least they lent credence to it. They thought that it might be true. That in fact the whole thing, the whole Kursk affair, was a trap that the Russians laid for the Ukrainians and which the Ukrainians walked into. Anyway, there we go. That's my view about the Kursk operation. What is going on elsewhere? Well, the most important piece of news over the last 24 hours is that the Russian Defense Ministry has now confirmed the capture of Ostrivske, this village to immediately northwest of Kurakovo. It's now a village which is on the Kurakovo reservoir. The Russians have broken through and they are in control of this village. Now, to repeat again, a point I've made several times, the capture of Ostrivske was being discussed on the Russian Defense Ministry's Telegram channel about 10 days before the actual, the various mapping and reporting projects acknowledged that the Russians were indeed in Ostrivske, based on photographic and film evidence. And, well, it's about at least 2 weeks, probably longer, since those first reports about this on the Russian Defense Ministry's website. It's taken, as I said, several weeks for the Russian Defense Ministry to confirm that Ostrivske is indeed under Russian control. But it looks as if it is, and there are even some reports that the Russians have pushed south from Ostrivske and have entered Kurakovo itself, though to be clear, we are talking about a part of Kurakovo which is located just north of a stretch of water that forms part of the Kurakovo reservoir and which is not directly contiguous with the rest of Kurakovo itself. Now, as has been pointed out, the fall of Ostrivske and the fall of Gostre just to the east of Ostrivske also means that the Ukrainian defense of the village of Maximilianovka, which is immediately to the west of Kurakovo, but south of Gostre, well, the Ukrainian defense there must soon come to an end. The Russians will very soon have control of that village as well, and they will be in a position to advance further towards Kurakovo itself through Maximilianovka as well. And, well, elsewhere in the Vuhledar area, so far there's been no Russian attempt to capture the village of Bogoyavlenka, though we are hearing lots of reports of the Russians coming very close to Bogoyavlenka. It seems that the Russians are clearing the fortifications, various fortifications and trench lines that the Ukrainians have hurriedly created south of Bogoyavlenka. But anyway, an attack on Bogoyavlenka can only be a matter of time. And if Bogoyavlenka falls, then the Russians, of course, have another route to attack Kurakovo from the south and to start cutting Ukrainian supplies to Kurakovo from the west, just saying. And in the meantime, there are lots of reports of the Russians fighting in Katerinovka and Antonovka. These are villages to the west of Konstantinovka, still under Ukrainian control. Villages that lie northwest of Bogoyavlenka itself. And anyway, the battle in this area continues to shape. But as I said, ultimately the objective is Kurakovo. Anyway, the fall of Ostrivska, however, perhaps its most important aspect is in what it is going to do for the Ukrainian troops located in that cauldron that's now developing, the Ukrainian troops in Vovchenka, Alexandropil, Kurachivka, Giernik, and Izmailivka. Now, here, the Russian Defense Ministry has corrected what some people are suggesting might have been an error. A couple of days ago, the Russian Defense Ministry claimed that the Russians had captured a village called Zoryane Persha. Various commentators pointed out that there is no such village on any map. There is a village called Zoryane, which apparently is a amalgamation of various smaller villages which had existed during the Soviet era, none of which, however, during the Soviet era had the name of Zoryane Persha. So there's some uncertainty as to exactly what the Russian Defense Ministry was talking about. My own guess is that the Russian Defense Ministry meant that one of these small subsidiary villages had probably been occupied by the Russians. But anyway, it looks as if the Defense Ministry, the Russian Defense Ministry, itself has understood that its earlier claim was wrong, and that that it was being misconstrued to mean that the entire village of Zoryane had fallen under Russian control. And without actually retracting that claim, or the appearance of that claim, they're no longer reporting it. So more likely than not, Zoryane, as well as Kurachivka, Giernik, Izmailivka, Alexandropil, and Vovchenka, continue to be under Ukrainian control. But the Ukrainians are trapped. The Russians control Zelanye Pershe and Zelanye Druha to the north. They control Ukrainsk, also to the north. Their troops control apparently a part of Giernik. They also control Tsukurinye, a little to the northwest. And we now have apparently confirmation that the Russians have indeed entered Novoselidivka and Izmailivka, two villages south of Tsukurinye, in force, and that they control part of these villages. It's been suggested that earlier claims that Russian troops had entered these two villages referred to Russian reconnaissance units rather than to a serious attempt by the Russian army to break into Novoselidivka and Izmailivka. But it seems that it has begun now. And of course, with the Russians in Ostrivska and Gostre, one can see the circle around the Ukrainian troops in these four villages starting to form. If Novoselidivka falls under Russian control, then the Russians perhaps can advance along a main road all the way to the Kurakovo reservoir, in which case the Ukrainian troops would be cut off in all of these villages and possibly cut off in the village of Ilinka as well. Though I suspect this would be a tough operation and there might be some tough battles. But in the meantime, as I also discussed in a program that I did some days ago, it looks as if Russian drones are very active along all of the roads in this area, particularly the roads that lead towards these villages, which pass through Sonsivka and Stary Terny. And I'm going to suggest that this is a particular area where the Russian Orion drones, the drones which are the Russian equivalents of the American Reapers and Predators, are particularly active, because these are the kind of drones that can patrol over long periods and which have the ability to conduct multiple strikes, because of course they are equipped with missiles. They are in effect missile launchers. So it's likely, if as I said in my previous program, it looks as if use of these roads for the Ukrainians now is extremely difficult. So we have this cauldron in these villages. We have the Battle of Kurakovo apparently about to begin. And of course, further north still, we have all kinds of pictures and maps now showing Russian pincers closing around the big town of Selidovo to the north of all of these places. We have pictures that show Russian troops inside northeastern Selidovo. We have lots of pictures that show the Russians gradually edging towards the village of Vishneve from the south, and also pushing towards the village of Vishneve from the north. Vishneve is located immediately to the west of Selidovo. If the Russians capture this village, Selidovo is encircled. So this battle is ongoing for Selidovo. A couple of days ago, I said that there were reports that the Ukrainian military leadership is now giving serious thought to a withdrawal from the towns of Kurakovo and Selidovo, and is thinking of consolidating and trying to defend Pokrovsk itself. Pokrovsk as the major position that needs to be held in this area. And what I'm now hearing is that this debate, these discussions about a potential pullout from Selidovo and Kurakovo, a retreat from these two towns, that this is coming at the urgent request of the commanders of the Ukrainian units who are stationed in both of these towns. Both are telling Kiev that if they remain much longer where they are, they risk encirclement, and they are asking for permission to withdraw. Well, if that is the case, then I'm going to make a prediction that those requests are going to be refused. Zelensky and Syrsky, their policy always is to hold positions beyond reason, to risk the encirclement of troops where they are. Even when the troops are encircled, the order is given to keep fighting and to hold on. And I think that that is again what they're going to do. And at some point, we're going to see, as a result, another disaster for the Ukrainians in Kurakovo and Selidovo as well. Anyway, there's been a big flurry of comments, mostly from Ukrainian sources, about Pokrovsk. The Ukrainians, DS, has now essentially admitted that the Russians have captured, I understand, the western part of the village of Mikhailovka, immediately to the south of Mirnograd. My own view is that the Russians captured this village some time ago. There are lots of pictures and maps which appear to show the Russians steadily clearing all of the fortified lines south, all the fortifications that had been hurriedly constructed in the fields south of Pokrovsk and Mirnograd. There's apparently a film that shows an attempted Ukrainian attack on Russian positions along a railway line, which is apparently just a kilometre south of Mirnograd itself. And the indications appear to be that this counterattack, this Ukrainian counterattack, was repelled. So it looks as if the Russians are very close to Pokrovsk and to Mirnograd, and just as I've said, it could be that the attack on this village, on these two places, is now just days away. There's also, by the way, reports that the Russians have begun an attack on a village called Promin, which lies north of Mikhailovka and which is east of the southern spur of Mirnograd, that the Russians are now very, very close to. So anyway, there we go. The battle for these places is now looming over the horizon. And there's a report that's appeared somewhere in the American media, I believe it was, that not only would the fall of Pokrovsk be a disaster for the Ukrainians from a logistical and military point of view, though in truth, the days when Pokrovsk could have acted as a logistical hub for Ukrainian forces in Konstantinovka and Chasiv Yar must have ended by now. But that the fall of Pokrovsk and the area around it is going to be a disaster for the Ukrainian economy, because steel production continues to represent a key aspect, a key element of Ukrainian industry, and coking coal, essential for Ukraine's steel industry, is largely mined around Pokrovsk, and that the mines, if Ukraine loses access to the mines around Pokrovsk, then production of steel in Ukraine will effectively come to a stop. By the way, I would say that if Ukrainian steel mills still use coking coal, then they're still dependent, as I suspect they are, by the way, on an older technology, because I understand that it's now become possible to smelt steel without having to use coking coal. I don't know how widespread this practice is, but apparently over the last 10 years, this practice has started to spread, including in Russia, incidentally. But I would not be surprised if the Ukrainian steel industry has not caught up with these recent developments. Also, it's hardly likely that any coal mining is taking place around Pokrovsk at the present time. I mean, with fighting going on literally a kilometre from Mirnograd and 5 kilometres from Pokrovsk, what possible coal mining can still be taking place? So this is a disaster for Ukraine's steel industry. Then it must be a disaster that is already playing out. But of course, Ukraine will probably have stockpiled coking coal, so the steel mills will no doubt be able to draw on those stockpiles at least for a while. And Ukraine has previously imported coal from other places, from South Africa, for example, and Australia, and I believe the United States. and no doubt they could do so again. But anyway, the problems for the Ukrainian economy will continue to mount. And Pokrovsk may not be the biggest place. It's apparently reduced to a population of about 50,000, 90,000 if you include Mirnograd. It was apparently much, much bigger, far bigger population in the Soviet period. But anyway, it may not be the biggest of places, but we can see that it does have a certain importance, a key importance in the Ukrainian economic and industrial system, and its loss would be an economic blow for Ukraine. By the way, Ukrainian commentators seem to take it as read that once the Russians capture Pokrovsk, they will advance westwards towards Pavlograd and Dnipro and the Dnieper River, even as they advance from the south through perhaps Velika Novosilka and Orechov and these other places towards Zaporozhye, also, of course, on the Dnieper River, just south of Dnipro itself, that the Russians will advance, in other words, west from Pokrovsk rather than north towards Kramatorsk and Slavyansk, because there are no defences to speak of. To the west, the Ukrainians supposedly are trying hurriedly to create defences in Dnipro itself in anticipation of the fall of Pokrovsk. I think this is probably true, but to repeat again a point I have made many times, I don't know what Russian plans are. The Russian General Staff doesn't share its information with me. My guess is that this is probably true, that the advantage of advancing to the Dnieper, the military advantage, is too strong, and that this is what the Russians are going to do, even if it does mean moving beyond the four regions, moving outside Zaporozhye and the Donbass. And I think that the Russians probably calculate that before long, Slavyansk and the forces in Slavyansk and Chasiv Yar Slavyansk and Kramatorsk and Konstantinovka can be taken care of by the Russian forces located in Toretsk, which will soon fall, and Chasiv Yar and Siversk, and that they don't really need the forces in Pokrovsk to play any part in that. Anyway, there's also further news further north, close to Kupiansk. As I said, I've not covered this part of the war in so much detail, but it seems that the Russians have now reached the Oskol River, that fighting is taking place in two villages, Kolesnikivka and Kruglyakivka, both on the Oskol River, west of the village of Peshanye, which the Russians have captured, and that, of course, the Russians, as I've discussed previously, are already fighting inside the village of Petropavlovka, which is located just east of Kupiansk. So anyway, there we are. A disastrous picture for the Ukrainian forces. Nothing can change this outcome. Supplying JASSM's missiles to Ukraine is not going to change this outcome. There is no sign of any political shift, any diplomatic moves by the Western powers. Everybody wants to see what America is going to decide in November and what the next president is going to do. But one way or the other, whether this conflict ends diplomatically or militarily, we're approaching the end of the affair, and it will be the Russians who, in the end, will decide the terms. So that's my program for today. More from me soon. Let me remind you all again that you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. You can support our work also via Patreon and Subscribestar, links under this video. And don't forget also to check out our shop. And last but not least, if you've liked this program, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.